Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take your sources, the articles, the research, the transcripts you send us, and we really plunge in.
Yeah, we look for those essential nuggets of knowledge, those insights you might miss.
Exactly, to help you feel truly informed.
Think of us as your guides,
Yeah.
helping you navigate the information you've shared. We're here to sort of point out what stands out in the material and, from its perspective, why it might matter.
And this deep dive is specifically for you, based on material you provided. Today, we're tackling something, well, pretty intriguing.
It definitely is.
A perceived blackout event. According to this source, it hit Spain, Portugal, and parts of France on April 28th, 2025.
Now, we should say up front, the source material here is, well, it's highly unconventional.
Right.
It's a transcript from a hypnotic regression session, and it explores the perceived causes, the implications of this event from some very, let's say, unexpected levels.
Absolutely. So our mission today, unpack the diverse, sometimes frankly startling layers of information in this specific source about this perceived event.
It touches on geopolitics, energy
Mhm.
control.
And definitely some entities you might not usually connect with power grids.
Hmm.
So what can we actually learn from this unique perspective?
Let's find out.
All right, let's dive in. So the source sets the scene, April 28, 2025. Parts of Europe go dark, a blackout.
Mhm.
One of the first things explored in the transcript is, well, where did the energy go? What was the perception?
According to this source, the perception wasn't that the electrical energy just vanished. Not at all.
Okay.
It was seen as being held, or maybe condensed,
Yeah.
in specific geographic locations. Right at that moment, the blackout hit Spain, Portugal, southern France.
Held. And where were these points? Where was it perceived to be concentrated?
Primarily south of Spain, specifically around Gibraltar,
Mm-hmm.
and crucially across into North Africa, particularly Morocco.
Gibraltar and Morocco.
Yes.
Yeah.
And a portion was also perceived as contained within France itself. It's described almost like the energy was deliberately sort of retained
Wow.
in those two main hubs,
Right.
southern France, Gibraltar, and North Africa.
Okay, let's unpack that. The source doesn't just stop at where it went, it digs into the causes. What was the perceived physical reason for the energy being held back like that?
The perceived physical cause, as described in this session, was an absorption and a blocking,
Ah.
orchestrated by the neighboring countries we just mentioned, France and Morocco. The source perceived this as a deliberate, knowing act by those two nations.
And how was that mechanism perceived? You mentioned blocking. The source talks about energy dispensers.
Yes, the perception was quite visual, like seeing two main energy dispensers or maybe control points.
Okay.
One specifically for renewable energies, like all that solar power Spain has, and another for energy coming from outside Spain, like fossil fuels or nuclear power from other European countries.
Got it.
And the source perceived that at the precise moment of the blackout, the dispenser for Spain's excess renewable energy, particularly solar, was completely blocked, just cut off.
Completely cut. Wow. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because the source definitely doesn't stop at the physical or the geopolitical stuff. It goes deeper. What was perceived as the underlying, maybe esoteric or metaphysical cause behind it all.
Right. The source explicitly said there wasn't a traditional causa esoterica como tal. No magic ritual, nothing like that.
Okay.
But it immediately perceived this deeper layer. Economic, geopolitical, energy manipulation. And the key thing, this manipulation was perceived as being orchestrated by non-human entities.
Non-human entities planning a blackout. What kind were perceived? Who is running the show, so to speak?
At what the source called the cupola, basically the highest level of perceived control or planning.
Yeah.
The entities seen were insectoids and reptiloids.
Insectoids and reptiloids.
Yes. The source perceived insectoids as somehow linked to Spanish and maybe broader European interests, while reptiles or reptiloid energy were perceived as strongly linked to France and Morocco, respectively, at that high level.
That's quite something. So from this source's viewpoint, what was the actual goal? The agenda of this non-human manipulation regarding energy?
The perceived plan was very specific. Manipulate energy interests to force a move towards nuclear power.
Ah.
And at the same time, actively deny space for block renewable energies, especially solar. It was seen as a deliberate strategic push to sideline solar power.
And the source also mentions specific humans involved in planning meetings, but guided by these entities.
Yes, exactly. Military figures from Morocco were perceived as being present in a planning meeting related to this.
Okay.
And a really striking detail from the source. When viewed energetically, or by a perceived DNA scan. Some of these individuals were actually seen as being reptiloids, or even draconians, despite looking human physically.
Draconians.
Yeah. So a key takeaway here from the source is this perception that, what looks like conventional geopolitics and energy strategy might, from this viewpoint, be influenced at a very deep, non-human level, with specific entity types tied to different national interests.
And it wasn't just military figures. The source perceives governments were in on it. Which ones knew? What were they supposedly doing?
The perception was, yes, the governments of Spain, France, and Morocco were aware and actively participating. Yeah. The source described a private meeting, key figures representing these nations, discussing this blackout.
And there's that really extraordinary perception about the leaders themselves at this meeting.
This is where the transcript gets particularly unusual.
Right.
The source perceived the president of Spain, the king of Morocco, and the figure representing France identified as Macron, not as being truly themselves, but as simulants. Basically, bodies being operated or heavily influenced by these entities.
Wow.
And Macron's wife was also perceived as present, an observer, and potentially non-human herself, like an octopus entity, according to that same energetic DNA scan.
An octopus entity. Okay. A perceived secret meeting, underground bunkers, non-human entities maybe controlling leaders, planning an energy blackout. Where did this meeting happen? And what was the explicit point?
The source perceived it happening in underground bunkers. And crucially, it wasn't right before the event. It was the previous year, specifically to plan this experimental blackout.
An experiment, and the real motivation discussed in this meeting. It wasn't what they tell the public, I assume.
Not at all. The source states the real goal discussed was purely political, purely interest-based.
Which was?
To make Spain and Portugal energetically dependent on Morocco and France.
Dependency.
Yeah, the source was very clear. This perceived plan had nothing to do with things they pretended the population thought, or would be led to think.
So what were they planning to tell people? What was the public narrative meant to be?
The plan, according to this source, was all about shaping perception. Made people believe solar and renewables just aren't enough.
Right.
That nuclear energy is essential, and that, the blackout could easily be blamed on Russia. Using the phrase, as always, sort of mockingly, from the source's perspective.
And the timing, the specific time of the blackout was part of this manipulation too.
Yes, the source noted that. They planned to cut the power at peak solar production time, specifically 12:38 p.m. peninsular time in Spain.
Right at peak sun.
Exactly. Perceived as deliberate. To make the argument about solar being insufficient seem more plausible to the public.
Okay, so this section of the source really lays out a perceived conspiracy. Political leaders, potentially controlled by non-humans, creating an energy crisis to force dependency, push nuclear, and planning a whole false story for the public. That's quite a view on geopolitics.
It certainly is.
Now, moving beyond the perceived planners, what about the people experiencing this? What was the perceived impact on the collective consciousness in Spain, Portugal, southern France?
In those areas directly hit, the collective consciousness was perceived to feel fear.
Fear?
Yeah, a sense of helplessness, needing to depend on other countries, other energy sources, a feeling that renewables were inadequate, just a general sense of catastrophe.
And what about surrounding nations? How did they perceive it?
For the neighbors, the perceived reaction was alarm. It seemed to trigger a push towards getting or securing nuclear energy, fear of future attacks on energy grids. And for countries without nuclear, a sense of needing maybe rearmament or becoming more dependent on those who do have nuclear power.
Which kind of feeds back into the source's earlier point about the motive, right?
Exactly. This perceived widespread alarm, this focus on nuclear independency, was seen as the intended outcome.
Right.
The outcome of a deliberate act by governments and entities aiming for nuclear control, not some accident or a random hacker attack.
Now, one of the most striking parts of the source, for me anyway, was the actual public reaction during the blackout itself. The planners seemed to expect chaos.
That's a fascinating contrast, isn't it?
Yeah.
Described right there in the transcript.
Yeah.
It perceived figures like the Spanish president, through their alleged actions, media messages, actively trying to generate fear and chaos.
Trying to stir things up.
Exactly.
Yep.
But the perceived actual reaction from the public, fundamentally calm, surprisingly so. People felt it was a good day, even. They went outside, talked to neighbors, helped each other. There's that detail about bars extending credit.
Brotherhood, the source said.
Yeah, real brotherhood. People felt annoyed, sure, but not fear, not panic. They enjoyed simple things, reading, playing with kids, walking.
Mm.
And crucially, despite perceived attempts to instill fear of looting or crime, the source saw none of that widespread chaos happening.
That's a profound disconnect, a perceived alternate effect. What did the source think happened when people were suddenly cut off from tech, internet, media?
This is where the source introduces this idea of perceived technological manipulation.
Okay.
It suggested that being disconnected from tech, specifically AI, internet, media, meant that a perceived manipulation network, or maybe programming, that supposedly sent through these channels, impacting the pineal gland, it just seemed to disappear.
Disappear.
Yeah, the description was like people felt disconnected from the radio, and instead they perceived themselves connecting more with their own inner thoughts and with each other directly.
And was there a perceived physical effect in the brain?
Yes, the source perceived the pineal gland, the brain itself, feeling a respite, like this programming network was physically removed.
A respite.
Yeah. The perceived liquids in the brain were seen to sort of lower, become calm, relaxed, not tense, not hyper-alert.
So this part of the source offers a really interesting perspective, doesn't it, on the potential impact of constant digital connection, suggesting it might serve a manipulative purpose from this viewpoint.
And that disconnection could have these unexpected positive effects on consciousness, on social interaction.
The source also touched on why Spain and Portugal specifically might have been targets for this perceived event.
The perception there was that these areas, especially with all their sun, their potential for a happy, high vibrational life,
Right.
are perceived as being specifically targeted, brutally attacked, the source said, by these entities, draconians, insectoids.
Why?
Because this happiness, this high vibration, is perceived as raising the planet's overall vibration.
They don't want that.
Exactly. It conflicts with their perceived agenda. But the source also noted, ultimately, they wouldn't succeed in stopping it.
Let's widen the lens again. Connect this perceived event back to global geopolitics from the source's perspective.
Okay. The perceived link is centered in Europe, yes, but with a very strong tie to Morocco.
Morocco again.
Yeah. Seen through alleged internal agreements covering energy, gas, electricity, nuclear, and military stuff, too. Morocco is perceived as having absolute control over energy entering Europe from Africa, just because of where it sits geographically.
Okay. And what was the future outlook? As perceived in early May 2025, right after the event supposedly happened.
Well, regarding investigations, the source perceived Portugal's government, allegedly unaware of the deeper plot, was actively demanding answers from Spain.
Understandably.
Right. Technical experts, engineers were perceived to be investigating, but the source claimed the data was being messed with, manipulated with external payments to hide the truth.
And Germany. Germany was perceived as playing a significant, maybe unexpected role.
Yes, this is interesting. Germany and Italy, following close behind, were perceived as having realized this wasn't normal, not just a glitch.
Okay.
And they'd launched a deep internal investigation. The source described them using
Lies.
physical people, described as looking very hippie, embedded in the affected countries, France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, but also surrounding areas, Canary Islands, Morocco, even Nigeria. Suggests a very broad scope to their perceived intelligence gathering.
And what was the predicted outcome of this German and Italian investigation, according to the source?
The source predicted they would uncover the plot, the whole thing, and impose severe sanctions, specifically on Spain and France.
Why them?
Because they were perceived as the EU members directly involved alongside Morocco in generating this chaos within Europe's energy system.
What about other global players? Did the source see anyone else noticing, taking this seriously?
Oh, yes. The depth of the perceived German-Italian investigation meant no more experimental blackouts like this were predicted right away. But countries like the USA, Russia, Canada, Mexico, Argentina, they were perceived as alerted. They reportedly saw it as a clear manipulation attempt towards global nuclear energy control, potential expansion.
So the test backfired, in a way.
The source described it as a test that was done badly. And paradoxically, it ended up opening everyone's eyes globally to this kind of potential manipulation.
And Russia's reaction, that was particularly notable in the source, wasn't it?
According to the source, yes. Russia was perceived as almost laughing about it.
Laughing.
Yeah, knowing they'd likely get blamed, but seeing it as other nations basically digging their own graves. With Russia's huge energy resources, the source perceived they don't really care about Europe's immediate energy problems. They're just waiting.
Waiting for what?
Waiting for the internal conflicts, the dependencies within Europe, to create an opportunity for them to gain leverage later on. The source used that Spanish phrase.
Río revuelto, ganancia de pescadores.
Exactly. Troubled waters, fishermen's gain. So Russia's apparent silence wasn't seen as ignorance. It was perceived as a deliberate choice, hiding their awareness, intending to profit from Europe's self-inflicted energy mess down the line.
So this part of the source paints a picture of a kind of global wake-up call, triggered by a seemingly regional event, but exposing these perceived deeper power struggles, strategic plays.
Yeah, with some nations positioning themselves to benefit from crises, others supposedly engineered.
The source also spent some time on different types of energy, their perceived roles in this bigger picture. Can we break those down?
Sure. Let's start with fossil energy. Petroleum, oil, perceived as ancient, heavy, from the deep earth, remnants of old civilizations, dinosaurs, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Seen as becoming obsolete, expensive. And intentionally held in controlled pockets, Russia, Alaska were mentioned almost like a weapon. Though modern tech, perceived tech, is starting to bypass it.
Right. Then renewable energy. Solar, wind, hydro.
Perceived as coming directly from nature. Solar in Spain. Incredibly abundant, according to the source. Calling it insufficient was seen as just a lie.
A lie.
Yeah. Solar was even perceived as potentially healing.
Yeah.
Hydro from water, wind from turbines, all natural sources.
Atomic or nuclear energy. The source used the term energia atomica.
Perceived as extremely dangerous.
Yeah.
Produced in labs.
Right.
Manipulating it.
Yeah.
Very risky. Inherently linked to destruction, Chernobyl, Fukushima were mentioned contextually, Hiroshima and Nagasaki explicitly.
Wow.
Seen as unnecessary, given the other resources, but pushed relentlessly for perceived power and control.
And finally, there was that really unique one, energy from sound.
Yes, from dripping stalactites. In an Australian cave, perceived as capable of affecting energetic structures, even carbon structures, suggested potential medical uses. It just highlights the very wide range of energy types perceived by the source.
And there was that really clear perceived link, pushing nuclear equals control.
Yes, a core theme. The source stated flat out, countries dependent on nuclear become slaves to those who have it.
Slaves.
Yeah. Having nuclear power, from this perspective, isn't just about electricity. It's fundamentally perceived as being about control, capacity, power over others.
Which countries were perceived to actually have nuclear capabilities? Openly or maybe hidden?
The source listed Morocco, France, Italy, India, China, Korea, Mexico, Iran, Australia, and Pakistan. Specifically noting Pakistan's perceived use was mainly to scare people.
Okay.
And the alarm perceived in other countries seeing this blackout. It was seen as proof. Proof that nations get how delicate and dangerous this manipulation is.
They don't want renewables to succeed.
Because if renewables prove sufficient, it undermines the whole narrative that nuclear is essential. And having nuclear is perceived as a symbol of power.
Right.
It's seen as a model built for control, submission, dependency, trying to make countries believe their own natural, abundant resources are somehow worthless compared to nuclear energy.
Now, it's really crucial, isn't it, to circle back and remember the nature of this source material, where this information comes from.
Absolutely vital. This is all derived from a hypnotic session.
Right.
And the source itself, the channel owner who conducts these sessions, is actually quite upfront about the potential limits of info from just one session.
ER, yeah.
They explain their research protocol involves looking at hundreds, maybe thousands of sessions to find corroborated information, those pepitas de oro, gold nuggets, verified core insights.
Right. They explicitly state that information from just one session, especially about specific people or events that aren't corroborated across many sessions.
Could be highly contaminated or distorted.
By what?
By entities, they suggest.
Yeah.
Or the subject's own mind, their beliefs. Or even needing specific energetic authorization to access reliable information on certain topics.
So what's fascinating here, then, is how do we hold these incredibly detailed, surprising, frankly bizarre claims from this single session alongside the source's own stated methodology, their own skepticism about uncorroborated single-session data?
That raises a really crucial point, doesn't it? It forces us, I think, to think critically about the origin and the potential layers of distortion in any information we get,
Mm-hmm.
especially when it comes from unconventional sources, unexpected places, challenging our basic understanding of how things work.
Yeah.
And this particular source, with its wild claims about simulants and entities right next to its own warnings about verification,
Yeah.
it's a perfect example of that challenge.
Wow. That truly was quite a deep dive unpacking that source material.
It really was.
From perceived geopolitical plots, non-human entities, secret bunkers, to the mechanics of energy absorption, and that surprisingly calm public reaction to a deliberate blackout. We navigated some very unconventional territory.
Indeed. It certainly gives us and you a lot to consider. About potential hidden dynamics maybe in global events, from this specific perspective, of course.
Right.
The perceived struggle between energy paradigms, even the unexpected ways human consciousness might be perceived to react when disconnected from the constant digital noise.
So what does this all mean for you, our listener? Well, this deep dive into a single, really fascinating source, it might make you think differently about where your energy comes from, or how easily narratives might be shaped or tempted to be shaped, anyway, to control how people see things.
It really highlights the value, doesn't it, regardless of the source type, of just stepping back sometimes, questioning apparent realities, considering that things might not always be exactly as they seem right there on the surface.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, we build these dives specifically for listeners like you, taking your sources, finding the crucial insights within them, no matter how unconventional that source might be.
So if you're curious about a topic and you have source material you'd like us to explore, definitely let us know.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and maybe, just maybe, appreciate those unexpected, quiet moments in life, the digital-free ones.